Tonight, we'll be talking about religion and politics. Is there a better way? Let me give a brief intro here, because in some ways it's hard to say something new about a topic that is out there so much in the media, in websites and social media. So what can we add to that conversation? Well, as Christians, we believe that scholarship matters, that the rigorous pursuit of truth in any discipline, including politics, yields important and useful insights to us. So what does the scholarly study of political behavior reveal about Christian political engagement? Can we use politics for good? And if so, what are the dangers and pitfalls in doing so? So we have two scholars from the U of M community here to help us explore these issues. The first speaker is Shayla Olson. She is a PhD student in political science here at Michigan. She did her bachelor's degree in political science and government at Indiana State University, and her master's in political science and government at a little school up in East Lansing that we know of as well. And so she is a graduate of both those institutions. She studies specifically American political behavior using both quantitative and qualitative methods, focusing on the interaction between race and religion. So a couple of very non-controversial topics there for her to deal with. And then Dr. Kenneth Lowande is Associate Professor of Political Science and Public Policy here at the University of Michigan. He did his bachelor's degree in political science from Baylor University and his master's and PhD in government from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And specifically, Dr. Lowande studies how presidents use power, how Congress oversees the executive, or perhaps does not oversee the executive at times, and how unelected officials implement policy. His forthcoming book will be out this fall, called False Front: The Failed Promise of Presidential Power in a Polarized Age. Sounds like a very interesting title. That's with University of Chicago Press. So what we're going to do is really go in three parts here. So for the first segment, both of the speakers will speak with us about 15 minutes on their research and some implications of the research for our topic here. I will have some questions for them, and then we'll open it to the audience with questions as well. So hopefully you will be formulating some questions as you hear them speak over the next several minutes here. Okay, so first of all, I'll turn things over to Shayla, who will begin, and then we'll go to Kenny. So let me get out of my slides and move to the next. All right, so let's welcome Shayla Olson.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for coming. I can hear the microphone is working. So in my section, I'm going to give you an overview of sort of American political behavior, and then I'm going to dive into what political behavior looks like for Christians in the United States. I'm going to start with a few important findings about American politics more generally. I'm calling these stylized facts, and they're sort of foundational for understanding current mass political behavior. And then I'm going to talk about how Christians engage in politics based on the data. So first, those stylized facts. The number one stylized fact is that parties matter. So a little bit of background. We're fortunate to be at the University of Michigan. Michigan has long been one of the leaders, if not the leader, for the study of American political behavior. Some of the most important research in this area has been done by scholars on this campus, actually just around the corner, at the Institute for Social Research on Thompson Street. And the first finding that is attributed to the Michigan School of Political Behavior is that parties matter. I'm sure that not many of you are very surprised by this, that Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans. And if you were trying to figure out how someone was going to vote in an election, the single thing that you'd probably want to know is how do you feel about those political parties? And this was written originally in a book called The American Voter, which was written by political scientists at the University of Michigan. What might be surprising is how stable this finding is. It turns out there are only about 10% of the public who won't answer the question, do you think of yourself as a Democrat or a Republican? One common thing that's said to me when I share that I'm a political scientist is that someone will say, well, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. However, there's usually one party that they lean towards, And we refer to these individuals as leaners. And it turns out those leaners still vote for a particular political party about 60% of the time. So Democrats vote for Democrats, Republicans vote for Republicans. In recent decades, it has become more and more common that Americans not only vote affirmatively for that party, but they also vote because of their distaste for another political party. Another comment that I hear is, well, we would really be better off if we had a strong third-party candidate. And to that I say, probably not going to happen. In political science, again, there's something called Duverger's law. And essentially what this law says is that the type of electoral system we have prevents third-party candidates from really emerging and being competitive in winning elections. I think as Christians, it's important for us to be aware of this fact when we try to make thoughtful decisions when we go to the ballot box in November. The second stylized fact is that we are relatively uninformed about politics as Americans. Now, this makes total sense to me. We have jobs and families and hobbies and so many ways to fill up our schedules, like hanging out at the Christian Study Center. And I doubt many of us in this room, although you're here on a Thursday night, want to spend our precious time trying to learn about very complex political issues. In fact, a huge divide in American politics is between people who pay a lot of attention and those who do not care as much about politics, which is a much larger group of people. However, what this means is that low information voters sometimes make decisions about who they're voting for or come to opinions about particular political issues based on very simple heuristics. For example, pictured here are two political ads. On the left is John Kerry, who was trying to demonstrate that he's a laid-back and likable candidate by windsurfing in an ad. But the Bush campaign actually used this video to accuse Kerry of frequently changing his opinion on the Iraq War. The ad accused Kerry of going whichever way the wind blows. And then similarly, it turns out that Bill Clinton being able to play the saxophone was a very likable quality and was viewed very favorably by a lot of voters. So political scientists have found that when voters lack other information, they rely on characteristics such as a candidate's physical attractiveness, their gender and racial identity, even their name being recognizable or just listed first on the ballot. As such, the more that politicians can send these relatively simple signals, the more likely it is that they can mobilize people who may have stayed home otherwise. So we're uninformed, but maybe that's okay. It turns out, stylized fact number 3, is that we take information shortcuts. Instead of calling voters low information, I would prefer to say that we are operating in an information-rich environment where we have a multitude of sources and media competing for our attention. And knowing this, political elites are just simply trying to cut through the noise in order to send us a signal that they are looking out for our interests. We often look for information shortcuts, and some research has shown that we can make pretty good decisions based on only a little information, as long as that information provides a meaningful signal of the commitments of a particular politician or party. So you may have heard something called identity politics. The type of information shortcuts we often make are related to group membership, and sometimes this is called identity politics. However, when this term is thrown around, you may have heard it being thrown around with sort of negative connotations as an accusation that a political opponent is playing identity politics. However, politicians from both major political parties frequently are playing identity politics or engaging in the attempt to send signals about their commitments to particular groups. So going back to what I first shared, parties matter, one might view political parties as a type of group that provides a meaningful signal about policy stances. But other identities matter, such as race, gender, sexuality, or regional status. The two pictures here on, well, I guess my left, but on the right, show Mitt Romney and Bernie Sanders eating and preparing food at the Iowa State Fair, which is something that all candidates must do on the campaign trail. It's a way of impressing Midwesterners, in particular Iowans. letting them know that they'll eat the food. You don't want to make the mistake that one candidate made one year and only eat avocado fries. That did not go over well. You really got to get into the pork and the corn dogs at the fair. One of my favorite examples of identity politics or group politics is an advertisement that was used this past November, actually. Ohio was voting on whether to legalize recreational marijuana, and they used some unfortunate information that they had gathered on the University of Michigan, and their collective identity of being against Michigan, combined with this information, created this ad that essentially tried to convince Ohio voters that they should stop letting Michigan steal their tax dollars and they should legalize marijuana. I can't say that this ad caused it, but they did actually vote yes to legalize marijuana, so we can't say it didn't cause that either. And now moving into political behavior as it pertains to American Christians. The first thing I'm going to cover is partisanship, political polarization, and all the things I'm going to talk about are some of the trends that I think are the most important for us as Christians to really address and reflect on, especially in an election year. So first, polarization. Congress is becoming extremely polarized. This is a figure that shows from 1989 in the top left corner to 2011, basically ideological estimates of members of Congress. And you can see that the blue dots that represent Democrats get further and further away from the red dots that are Republicans. And it turns out that white Christians are even more polarized than the rest of the American population. So in this figure, this is pretty complex, but it's basically split apart by religious group. And in the top left, you can see white evangelicals and non-white evangelicals right next to that, mainline Christian Protestants, Black Protestants, and so forth. And basically what this figure is showing, the bigger space that you see, those blue boxes and red boxes mean that that group rates their out party as more extreme. So white evangelicals are much more likely to say that their political opponents are more extreme than white non-evangelicals and white non-Christians. Among non-white Christians, this doesn't seem to be as much the case. Another important trend that we should be following is beliefs in misinformation. Now, this figure here is actually data from 2010, and this is the percentage of certain groups that believe that Obama is a Muslim, and he's not. But it turns out that Protestants and Catholics, particularly white Protestants and white Catholics, are much more likely to believe that Obama is a Muslim than non-religious individuals in the United States. And then finally, the area of my research is on religion and race. Again, very non-controversial topics. But there are a set of policies we consider racialized policies, often attributed to being relevant for racial minorities and immigrants. And it turns out that comparing white Christians to white non-Christians, Christians look pretty distinct on these attitudes. This is data that comes from the 2020 American National Election Study, which again, housed at the University of Michigan. And it's considered the gold standard for survey data that we can get of the national population. And white Christians are much more likely to support building a wall on the southern border. They're much more likely to support separating children from undocumented immigrants from their parents. They're much more likely to support the death penalty. They're much more opposed to spending on welfare, and much more. And you might be thinking, well, there are other reasons that white Christians may have these policy opinions. And I can consider different factors such as partisanship and ideology, and it turns out these trends still stand. In addition, unfortunately, white Christians have more negative attitudes towards racial minorities, even as they're unrelated to policies. For example, they harbor more resentment towards Black Americans. They're more likely to believe negative stereotypes about Black and Hispanic Americans. They're more likely to believe that Muslims are terrorists. This is just to name a few of those attitudes. And finally, Thinking about politics and religion. You may have seen some of these different articles over the past few years, especially in 2016 and 2020. There's a big concern that politics are infecting the church, that people are choosing to leave religion because of politics. Political scientists have been observing these trends and have been concerned with this as well. And it turns out the data do support this. People are leaving the church, and it does seem to be because of politics. It turns out that the more you perceive political difference between you and the other members of your church, the more likely you are to stop attending, to decrease attending, and then to de-identify as a Christian altogether. So that leaves me with a few questions that I've been pondering, and I think we should all ponder. So first, how are our politics being shaped by our Christianity? This, I think, we commonly think of. We think of ourselves as Christians, and we believe that we take our worldview and our beliefs and our values with us when we vote in November and when we engage in politics in various ways. But another important question that we should consider is, how is our Christianity being shaped by our politics? Thank you. All you.
Okay. So Shayla, if that were a job talk, I'd be then over the moon. That was absolutely fantastic. That was a wonderful introduction to Christianity and politics. I have one thing to confess before I start talking, which is Shayla is an actual scholar of religion and politics. I am not. I'm a generalist, and what I do is study policy making and how it actually happens. But in the course of that, I've come across several cases which I think are useful for making generalizations. So what I'm going to do today is give you a couple of basics about how policy is made in the US. I'm going to talk about basically everything that happens after what Shayla just talked about, right, which is about public opinion and how people vote. I want to talk about how Christians have influenced policymaking over, say, the last 50 years. And the way I'm going to do that is by giving you a brief overview and then telling you a couple of stories that I think are particularly instructive. So here's a couple of basics, just things that you should have learned in high school civics, but I want to remind you of. So you may know that things are not very well on Capitol Hill these days. So if we want to start to study where do Christians influence the policies that we see the government producing, you have to know where policy is made. The textbook answer would be this institution, which is Congress, but for a variety of reasons that has changed over the last 50 years. So beginning in the 1970s, Congress started delegating vast amounts of discretion to what we sometimes call the administrative state, which is a set of 200 organizations that actually runs the government. Other things that happened in Congress, so it started becoming more understaffed. Its staff became less experienced. Members of Congress started seeing more benefits in obstructing its operations and blocking things that the other party wanted rather than actually governing. And especially over the last 20 years, the majorities in Congress have been razor thin. So even if they did, in theory, agree on things and worked well, it would be difficult to get consensus just because of the way rules, right? We have supermajoritarian institutions that prevent things from passing. So that makes it difficult to get things done in Congress, but that doesn't mean that policymaking has stopped. It's just happening somewhere else. So these are a number of additional pages that are published in the Code of Federal Regulations. That's basically a way of measuring how much policy government agencies are producing in absence of guidance from Congress. So you might have a law that was passed in, say, 1970, and an agency like the EPA is continually updating the Code of Federal Regulations with new policies to adapt to things like, say, climate change
or endangered species, things of that nature. So the implication there is, while most stories of Christians influencing policy today are about essentially lobbying the executive branch. Okay, a lot of it happens outside of public view. Okay, so in order to understand their influence, you have to look for cases like that. So what I'd like to do is to give you a couple of cases that are illustrative of important patterns. Okay, so the first case that I think is instructive is something called the Mexico City policy. Okay, now these are going to be kind of wonky cases. So if at any point you're like, well, what is he talking about, or what you want me to clarify something, it's actually quite normal in our discipline to be interrupted. We rarely give uninterrupted speeches. So just go ahead and raise your hand or just blurt it out. I don't care. It's not, I'm quite used to it. Okay, so what is this policy? The main question is, okay, we've got all these federal aid or these foreign aid dollars that the government gives out to mostly to address things like poverty, hunger, conditions all around the world. And the question is, can those foreign aid dollars be given out to organizations that perform abortions? Okay. Now the background here is that since beginning in the mid-1960s, demographers started telling politicians that we were headed for virtual chaos, that because of population growth rates and because we didn't produce enough food, there was going to be mass starvation, there was going to be civil unrest. So beginning in the 1960s, countries like the US, but mostly the US was the big player here for about the first 30 years or so, started funding population programs, basically to reduce the number of children that were born in the global south. Okay, so in the early years here, the agencies basically did whatever they wanted. And that included funding things like forced sterilization experiments. They invented new forms of abortion. Eventually, all of that was put a stop to by Congress, but then fast forward to the mid-1980s, and evangelical organizations, and mostly the Catholic Church, were worried that the government was still funding abortions in a kind of back-channel way, right? Because there were still foreign aid organizations that were performing abortions with their own money, but then we were giving them money for other purposes. So the argument was that we were effectively still subsidizing abortions being performed abroad. Okay, so, Catholic Church, Catholic bishops in the U.S. were actually successful in getting getting an outright ban on the funding foreign aid dollars going to any organization that provided abortion. Okay, so that's the Mexico City policy. And Christians were instrumental in lobbying for this. So my favorite story of this, this gentleman's name is Peter McPherson. He was actually the president of that little university up the road at some point. But at this time, in the 1980s, he's heading USAID, which gives out all of the U.S.'s foreign aid dollars. And he's sitting in his office one day, and the phone rings, and it's Ronald Reagan. And this is very strange, right? Ronald Reagan never calls agency heads. This is a weird thing in government. And Ronald Reagan says, hey, Peter, I have this other person, or this really nice lady on the other line, and she has some ideas about how you ought to run your organization. Would you sit and talk with her for a couple of hours? And he says, well, yes, you're the president, that's fine. And so the telephone operator then connects him with Mother Teresa. And so that's how he ended up talking with Mother Teresa for 2 hours about the sanctity of the unborn, right? And that's basically essentially how the Reagan administration adopted the Mexico City policy. Okay, so for the next, for the 40 years since, basically every president we've had has put this policy in place, right, to prevent foreign aid dollars from going indirectly funding abortions. Now, if you're a Christian and your faith leads you to be opposed to abortion, you might think that this is an unequivocal win. But it turns out reality is a lot more complicated than that. So the best public health research that we have on the effects of this policy suggests that it actually increases the number of abortions where it's operative. Now that sounds counterintuitive because it is, so let me explain how they think it happens. Basically, the same organizations that provide abortions in the global south also tend to provide a lot of contraceptives. Okay? And contraceptives are a lot more effective at preventing unwanted pregnancies, so they're a lot more effective at preventing abortions than making abortions expensive, which is basically what reducing foreign aid dollars does. So on net, in periods where a policy is operable, in this case the Bush administration, we saw more abortions where foreign aid dollars otherwise would have gone to these organizations. Okay. So what's surprising, and I think is right, you have to think about when you think about policies like this, right? So Mother Teresa was effectively lobbying for a policy that was that was pushing against the exact opposite of what I think that you would have intended, right? So did this reduce funds from going to abortion providers? Absolutely, we have the data to suggest it. Did it ultimately reduce the number of abortions? Probably not. It actually probably moved it in the opposite direction, okay? So that's case one. So case two is a more contemporary case. This is something called the faith-based initiatives. Okay, and again, let me give you a couple of details here. So the main question is, can evangelical organizations be discriminated against when they try to carry out government programs? So the background here is that the government contracts, when the government runs a social welfare program, like say educating incarcerated people, or providing, running a system of food banks or something like that. When it contracts with organizations, in the mid-1990s, many evangelical organizations wanted to do that kind of work, right? They viewed it as a mission field, and they said that they were being discriminated against, that they were being turned down because the bureaucracies that they wanted to contract with would say, well, we have to worry about separation of church and state, so we're not going to partner with you. And these organizations' argument was pretty simple, right? They believed that their faith made them actually more suited to do this kind of work, right? That this was, again, a kind of mission field that evangelical organizations ought to be involved in. So the Republicans in Congress passed the law. Clinton basically ignored that law. But then Bush was elected in 2000. And shortly after his election, he creates this office in the White House called the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. Okay, and then for the next 8 years, they released this steady drip of what appears to be very good news, right? So the agencies are revising their rules to make sure they're not discriminating against faith groups. And most importantly, they're showing over and over again that more money is being channeled to these groups that are connected, again, mostly to evangelical churches, but not just to them. Okay, but again, reality is a lot more complicated than that. This is John DiIulio. This is actually John DiIulio is actually a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania. He was the first head of the program in the White House, and he resigned after a year. And in his resignation letter, he called the entire initiative virtually empty. Okay, and his basic point in the resignation letter was that the White House was using Christians and using the program to build their political brand. Okay, this was the second in command. His name's J. David Quo. He died, or he also resigned, though he lasted, I think, 3 years instead of 1. He died shortly after his resignation of cancer, but before he did, he went public, and he said that he himself had used the programs to hold political events for vulnerable Republicans in the 2002 elections. And he also admitted that he had manipulated data that agencies fed them to show that there had been an increase in funding to those evangelical organizations. Okay, and most of these details were later confirmed in a government accountability report. The basic problem that the GAO identified was that when a contractor goes to a bureaucracy and wants to run one of these social welfare programs, the government's not allowed to ask them about their religion, so they don't know whether or not they're truly faith-based. So if you're the kind of person that wants to show that we're giving lots more money to evangelicals or Catholics or anyway, all you have to do is make some favorable guesses about which organizations are faith-based and which ones are not. And that's exactly what they were doing. Okay. So again here, I think it's obvious in this case that the Bush administration was successful in making sure that bureaucracies weren't excluding evangelicals for their programs. But it's also true that in this process, politics seeped in, right? So they inflated the impact of the program. They used the program to try to help aid Bush's re-election efforts. And also, by the way, Catholic and Jewish charities had been contracting with these same bureaucracies for years. So it's not even clear that there was a kind of faith-based, or that faith-based discrimination was going on, right? Okay. All right. So a couple of takeaways from these, right? These are just two cases, but I think there's a couple of common patterns that I think are true generally. So the first couple of things is, or the first thing you need to know about either Bush, Reagan, or any president, right? When you listen to Joe Biden or Donald Trump make promises, what they do, right, their whole business is telling you very simple stories about three things, really, right? One, what your faith, right, if you're a Christian, what that should lead you to support policy-wise, right? Should you support the Mexico City policy, or should you support, should you support any abortion or something like that? So they're designed to tell you very simplistic stories about how your faith informs policy choices. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to claim credit all the time, right? Their whole political survival depends on taking the things that they have done in office and packaging them in a way that makes it appear that they have served your interests. Okay, and then the last thing that I see that that politicians did in both of these cases is attempt to push Christians towards, like Shayla mentioned, towards being an identity group, right? Tried to coalesce them into an interest group that they could then serve and then mobilize for their own electoral support. But the other thing that is illustrative in both of these cases is that, well, the policy process is really complex. And most importantly, I think it often involves unintended consequences, right? And because it involves unintended consequences, choosing one policy over the other, I think, is often morally ambiguous because we can't observe, we ultimately don't know what the outcome of any single choice is going to be. And then the last thing that I'll point here, if I can venture into the normative or to the advice questions or segment of this, I think that me as a scholar, like when I've looked, right, so I had at one point, I had a very surface level understanding of both of the programs that I just told you about. And I would parrot the exact narrative that would be provided to me by Republican presidents about the Mexico City policy, or the Bush administration about faith-based initiatives. And it was only after spending a lot of time and doing a lot of investigation that I understood that the world was a lot more complex. And so that's led me to think to, whenever I hear someone say something like, okay, because I'm a Christian, I support policy X or policy Y, I'm much more hesitant to make statements like that, just because I know the world, there's a lot that I just don't know about the outcomes of that policy or how it's going to play out in the real world. Okay. And I guess I'll leave the one for, let's leave the last bullet point for discussion. So thanks for the opportunity to speak, and I guess we're on to the Q&A.
Bring the chairs forward, and if I can have both speakers come up, we will pepper you with questions until you're stumped. Thanks. So my first question is kind of more, I guess, on a personal level. I'm curious what led you into your field of study. What was it that about your own personal interest, perhaps your Christian faith, or other factors that led you to choose to study politics?
Well, I think I turned the microphone back on.
Yep, you're back on.
Okay. Well, a lot of the answer of what led me to political science over some other field is path dependence. I had great professors in my undergraduate university that were really encouraging me, and they happened to be in political science. But also a lot of the questions that I had while I was an undergraduate, leaving my hometown for the first time, which is a pretty small town in southern Illinois. I saw the 2016 election, and I just had so many questions about what is happening in this world. And when I asked those questions to the people I trusted most in the world, the responses I got, I just didn't feel very satisfied by. I didn't feel like the questions were really fully answered. And I wanted to understand more. I wanted to understand how we got to this place. I wanted to understand myself as a Christian, what are Christians doing and what should we be doing? And that led me to really wanting to dive deeper into this particular topic for my dissertation, actually.
It's really pretty similar, except for it was not the 2016 election that did it for me. Yeah, I had supportive professors in undergraduate and I enjoyed and was interested in their courses. I'm probably one of the more rare political scientists in that I've had an interest in the same subjects since I was an undergraduate. So I've always been interested in bureaucracy and executive policy making and that kind of thing. So and I mean, the honest answer is eventually it's path dependent. It's like you walk down a path and then one day you're doing it for a living. But I'm just, like, many times along that path, I came very close to becoming like a waiter. So.
Seems like a better alternative.
Most days, yeah.
Yeah, depending on tips, I guess.
Yeah.
Related to that, I guess, would be: do you feel that your Christian faith makes any difference in or affects how you approach your subject of study in any way?
Would you like to go first this time?
Sure. So how does my Christian faith inform? It mostly informs my conduct. So it informs my ethics, certainly, the way I conduct research, how transparently I do that. It informs my service. So there's a lot in academia that is not required of you, but would be good for everyone else if you did. So like a simple thing would be reviewing other people's papers on time. The modal way to do that would just be to not, take as long as possible. No one's ever going to see it because you're anonymous, but it's important, right? There's another person on the other side there that you don't know and you'll never talk to, and your actions directly affect their welfare. And there's a lot of circumstances like that where you don't have no one's forcing you to do anything. And so it's all up to, do I want to do it? And what does my morality and my faith lead me to think I should do? And that's usually serve others.
Yeah, I think as a political scientist, and then later just as an academic, as a political scientist, something that I value as a Christian is the truth. And this job is really trying to find the truth, to answer really tough questions, and to get the answer right. And so what Kenny said about Professor Lowande, I sorry if that's too informal, but what Kenny said about your research ethics and trying to be very transparent about the decisions that you make along the way with the data and with the kinds of questions that you ask. So the truth. I would also say that I care about this subject because I care about people. And I think looking at how Christians operate in the United States, there are varying opinions on whether Christians look like they love people. And I want to know, can we do better as Christians? As an academic, I think that my faith informs how I operate just on a daily basis as well. I want my colleagues to know me as the kindest person, the person they can count on to always be loving and to take them seriously and to take their job seriously. And I care a little bit less about the day-to-day of, did we do a lot of good statistics today? But I want them to know that they can always knock on my door for life issues and life, just experiencing life together, and the day-to-day really matters for that. So.